Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the International Energy Agency's flagship World Energy Outlook 2025, the most authoritative source of global energy analysis and projections. I'm Jethro Mullen, head of the IEA's communications team. I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, and by the World Energy Outlook's lead authors, IEA Director of Sustainability Technology and Outlooks, Laura Cozzi, and IEA Chief Energy Economist, Tim Gould. The full World Energy Outlook 2025 is, I would note, freely available on the IEA website, along with an AI GPT agent that helps you delve into the key findings. So, during today's event, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Laura and Tim will present the key findings of the report. We'll then take questions from the journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to send your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a short break right after the presentation to give you a chance to send your questions. With that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jethro. Greetings to everybody from International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Once again, as it happens every year in November, we are in front of you to share our key findings from our flagship publication, World Energy Outlook 2025. Dear colleagues, we come in front of every year, and our great World Energy Outlook team every year, throughout the year, reviews all the data points, new data points in energy, tens of thousands of data points, new projects, new policies, what happens throughout the year, and puts in their databases, in their modeling. And once again, we review all this data, projects, policies. And as far as the policies of the governments are concerned, this year they diverge substantially from each other. And in order to give the policymakers, governments, a framework, we have added new scenarios, a current policy scenario and access scenario, in addition to what we have. We hope that they all together, these multiple scenarios, give a good basis for discussions and decisions for governments, for industry, and all the stakeholders. Now, I said we have different scenarios, multiple scenarios. There are differences, of course, different pathways, but there are also commonalities. In my view, perhaps one of the most important takeaways, and it's a commonality in all the scenarios we have, is that the global energy security faces today unprecedented range of security threats. This is for multiple fuels, multiple technologies, and simultaneously. If I can give you a couple of data points or examples, for oil, we talk about the sanctions for some exporting countries. For natural gas, Russia's invasion of Ukraine created a huge amount of uncertainty in the gas markets. For electricity, different type of uncertainty in terms of blackouts we saw in a few countries. And there also, in addition to this traditional energy security risk, there are also emerging ones, such as the critical minerals supply chains, where we see a strong concentration. So looking at all of this, the energy security risks around the world, for different fuels, for different technologies, we think it is for the governments, it is a key priority to see what kind of energy policies they put in place when we look at the next years to come, and how they are going to make these energy security priorities combined with other priorities they have, such as affordability of energy prices, competitiveness of their economies, and the climate change. So this report that was ably prepared by under the leadership of my colleagues Lara Cozy and Tim Gould, and their great team of World Energy Outlook gives you lots of data, lots of scenarios, a lot of things to consider. One issue when I say energy security, I want to perhaps underline a bit boldly here, is the critical minerals. This is an area that IEA has been working since almost 5 years, maybe before many people in the energy world. We have put a lot of data, all the data on minings, investment projects, and demand consumption there, and we have been ringing the alarm bells that the critical mineral security may well be an important issue in the next years to come. And today, what we see is that these our heads-up calls are not anymore the IES call. They are not anymore theoretical, but we have seen in the recent months the export restrictions are a serious challenge for not only for the energy sector, but also for the other parts of the economy, car manufacturing, the AI, defense industry, and others. Here, when we look at our data, there are many things, the concentration that makes us worried. At the IEA, when it comes to energy sector, we believe concentration is not good, diversification is better. So therefore, especially in the refining of the critical minerals, we see a major concentration. Maybe one number from our report, and this is again in our databases, rare earth elements, a topic which is a lot in the newspapers, in the discussions, in the government agendas today. Today, rare elements, the 91% of the rare earth elements refining is happening in one single country. And seeing this big challenge, many countries push the button. A lot of rare earth elements refining projects are now in the pipeline. And when we look at all of them, we have all of them in our databases. When we look at all of them, when will they finish, which stage they are, even if we assume all these projects have started or planned, are implemented successfully, this 91% of the share of one single country in the rare earth elements refining will go to 75% only in 10 years of time. So from 91 to 75% in 10 years of time, still a big concentration of rare elements refining in one country. This is one of the issues in the energy security we highlight in our report, in addition to all other energy security challenges. And we say energy security is now similar or at the same level like the economic security and national security in many cases. Now, I have in the World Energy Outlook, we have a lot of, in my view, interesting topics, and I hope that our readers, our governments, our industry wouldn't just focus one thing and miss the other important findings. I chose 5 highlights for you, in my view, some of the key findings of this study. One of them is our world is thirsty for energy, for better lives, more productive lives, more healthier lives, and energy demand, energy services, demand for energy services will increase. But we are seeing some new driving countries coming in the picture in terms of the global energy demand. Who are those countries? I mean, until recently, we have seen China was the major driver of global energy demand growth. And slowly but surely, China will be replaced by India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and a few other emerging countries. So none of these countries will be alone replace China, what China is today, but as a combination, they will be the drivers of global energy demand growth in the next years to come. It shows in all of our scenarios, and my colleagues have documented this in the best way. A second finding, and which this is also very exciting of coming from this World Energy Outlook, is the following. It's about electricity. Since years, IEA has been saying that the electricity demand is growing very strongly among all the fuels. And recently we said the world may enter the age of electricity. And looking at the data today in the World Energy Outlook, I think we can comfortably say that the age of electricity has arrived. We will still use oil, we will still use gas, but the growth of electricity demand is spectacular. So I think my colleague Lara Cozy will take you through some of the key drivers there and the consequences. We think in addition to the usual drivers of global electricity demand growth, we have the artificial intelligence, we have the air conditioners and electric cars driving further the global electricity demand growth. And we are going to see that even though the electricity accounts about 20% of global energy today, we shouldn't forget that the electricity supplies energy more than 40% of the global economy. So it is a very important and essential fuel, essential technology. Now, of course, demand will grow, but which technologies we are going to use to generate electricity? Solar is going to play a pivotal role here, solar energy, big growth coming from solar. It is also important to see that the bulk of the electricity demand growth will come from the countries where we see a huge amount of solar radiation. They are solar-rich countries or solar potential-rich countries, and we see solar electricity will play an important role here, together with other renewables such as the wind or geothermal or hydropower. Nuclear, as we have said some time ago, nuclear is making a strong comeback. Of course, natural gas and other traditional fuels play an important role, depending on the country and depending on the scenario. Dear colleagues, my third point I wanted to mention is about what happens to oil and gas. In terms of oil, our different scenarios provide different pathways for oil demand growth. I think my colleague Tim Gould will tell you more about this. When we look at our scenario, the newly introduced current policy scenario, which is based on the policies legally enacted as of today, when we look at this scenario, we see the global oil demand rises in the next 2.5 decades. When we look at another scenario, for example, our stated policy scenario, which considers the policies which are in the pipeline to be implemented, we see global oil demand growth stops around 2030. Between those scenarios, I think there are many factors bring this difference. I think the main difference will be the rate of electrification of transportation sector. It's a very important sector, transportation, about accounts, I think, Laura, about 45%, 45% of the global oil consumption. So therefore, how the electrification of the transportation takes place, especially countries beyond China and Europe, will determine the shape of the oil demand growth. In terms of natural gas growth is strong. both in the current policy scenario and in our stated policy scenario. We have increased our expectations for gas in our state policy scenario, mainly as a result of the change in the government policies in the United States and the lower gas price assumptions. But in my view, the big news in the gas markets is the LNG. Our report shows a big wave of LNG is coming to the markets. I think my colleague Tim, I think we are going to talk about the LNG wave, don't you? What he will tell you, I can tell you just briefly here, more than 300 BCM of LNG, a new wave is going to come to the markets, mainly US, Qatar, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. This will change entirely the dynamics of the gas markets. The markets will be more of a buyer's market, and the issue will not be anymore to find the supply, but maybe many of those LNGs will look for accommodation, a home to be consumed. This will be an issue, and it's a good news, I would say, for the many importing and consuming countries, because it will put downward pressure on the prices. Fourth takeaway from my side is the climate change. So, dear colleagues, when we look at the climate change, I can say I see two trends, maybe. One of them is on the political domain. I talked with several government leaders, business leaders, stakeholders, and others. I see that the priority given to climate change at national and international level is in a decline in most cases. This is a picture that I see, but at the same time, of course, we know that the 2024, last year, was the hottest year in the history. So looking at those two things, in all our scenarios, we look at the implications, emission implications of our scenarios. Our current policy scenario is in line with the trajectory of almost 3 degrees Celsius. Our other scenario, the stated policy scenario, is about 2.5 degrees Celsius. And as we do in the recent years, we have also a net zero scenario, and net zero scenario is, of course, in line with the 1.5 degrees trajectory. For our net zero scenario, in order to reflect the recent emission trends and recent trends in the energy use and the others, we have made a overshooting between now and in the next years to come, and the decline of emissions will come after 2035 in a more steeper way than we had before, and my colleague Lara Cosi will tell you more about that. Dear colleagues, my last point, and I'll stop here, Jetro, I promise this is the last point I am going to mention. But it's a very important topic for me since years. It is the energy access to electricity, access to clean cooking in developing countries. This is an issue that the IEA has been focusing since almost 20 years. I am very happy to see that there are new voices just joining the IEA's voice here, caring about the access to clean energy and for cooking, and also for the electricity access. What we have done is that we look what are the best ways to provide access to electricity in emerging and developing countries, and for access to clean cooking, especially in Africa. We come up with scenarios and suggestions because we are very worried, dear colleagues, for electricity access. Years and years we have seen the last years a good improvement rate, but in the last 2-3 years, unfortunately, this improvement has stalled. And in terms of access to clean cooking, we see some improvements in different parts of the world, but when it comes to Africa, a key topic for the IEA, still 4 out of 5 families use wood, agricultural waste, animal waste for cooking, with serious health and energy implications. So these are my 5 takeaways from this very report, and I wanted to finish once again to thank our wonderful team of the World Energy Outlook, big team, hardworking team, an excellent team, and their leaders, my colleagues Laura Cosi and Tim Gould, and I will now pass the floor to them.
So thank you very much, Dr. Birol. Tim Gould and I will now take you through the more detailed findings of this year edition of the World Energy Outlook. And we thought it was useful to actually start reminding everyone that there is no single storyline about the future of energy, and that's why we are presenting multiple scenarios. A reminder again to all of you, none of those scenarios is a forecast. What we are exploring are implications of policy, technology, and market trends. And Dr. Birol took you already through what are the scenarios that we are presenting in this year's outlook. As you can see, we have widened the range of scenarios as the uncertainties in the economy and in energy policies has actually widened. As you know, we review very carefully what's happening on the policy space, and since the start of the year, we have actually detailed and seen at least 42 countries putting in place or changing regulation. So here we are going to describe to you 2 exploratory scenarios on which the policy setting is different. The CPS, which is anchored in today's enacted laws and measures, and that takes a cautious view on technology deployment, and the stated policy scenario where we also consider policies that are under consideration but where we exclude aspirational policies. We also have 2 normative scenarios. Dr. Birol just took you through the 2 of them. Again, we are updating our net zero by 2050 pathway and also putting forward a new roadmap to achieve universal access to electricity and clean cooking. It's useful to understand and start from understanding why do we need energy in the future, what will we need it for, and who will need it. So you can see very clearly that this is the basic demographic and economic trend that we are using across all of our scenarios. You already see here that where the economy will grow is going to be driven more and more by the service sector. This means digital, financial sector, healthcare. All of them have something in common. They're going to be fueled by electricity more than other fuels. We are also seeing a growth in industrial production. Petrochemicals is one of them, but increasingly is advanced manufacturing that is pulling up industrial energy uses. Again, the key characteristic of this is that it's fueled by electricity. We are going to witness, and we are actually witnessing as we speak, important demographic shifts. China has reached a peak in population, and we are expecting by 2035, China will have around 50 million people less than today, reaching the type of demographic structure that we are seeing in many advanced economies, such as Japan, such as Italy. So as a reminder, China has been driving energy trends for the past decade, and we are seeing this passing of a baton that Dr. Birol mentioned earlier to other emerging economies, to India and Southeast Asia, where we will see 230 million more people living there, to Latin America, to Middle East and Africa, where 350 million new people will be in the continent by 2035. So all these drivers, increasing wealth, increasing growth, increasing population, very clearly point to more things that need energy around the world. Cars, over 50% of the car sales in the next decade will happen in emerging countries and advanced in developing economies outside of China. a very profound shift compared to the past decade, where this was happening in China. Plastic production is growing, air conditioners is growing even stronger, and as you can see very clearly here, data center servers is one of the areas that are the most dynamic in the global economy and therefore in the energy sector as well. We have seen a doubling of those over the past decade, and we are expecting to see a further doubling to 2035. So what are the commonalities of the drivers that point in two very clear directions? Is that there is a shift in where the energy demand is coming from, slowly away from China towards India, Southeast Asia, and other emerging economies, and very clearly an increasing need for electricity to fuel our economies. So again, looking at commonalities among scenarios, what we're seeing is that in all our scenarios, electricity demand accelerates and accelerates very significantly. A very important point that you see actually here is that the electricity demand growth from now to 2035 is nearly identical in our two STEPS and CPS scenarios. How much we're expecting to actually see in terms of electricity demand growth is 10,000 terawatt hours. What is 10,000 terawatt hours? 10,000 terawatt hours is the electricity that is consumed today in the US, Canada, all of Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia. So is the amount of electricity that today we are consuming in all advanced economies combined, so that we have actually started consuming over the past 100 of years, that will be added in just 10 years. This is a very, very big shift that will demand, of course, a lot of investments and planning. Where is this demand happening? Well, first, a big shift compared to the past 10 years is what's happening in advanced economies. For the past 10 years, electricity demand in advanced economies has been very sluggish, but this is changing. Before our eyes, advanced economies' electricity demand is starting to grow again, and is starting to grow very significantly. China continues, it's already among the most electrified economies in the world, and continues this pathway towards increased electrification. Another step change we are actually seeing again in those emerging countries and developing economies through a variety of new uses that we are actually seeing here. We are seeing cooling and appliances really driving up electricity demand in those economies. Cooling, for example, accounts for 20% of demand growth in India. We are seeing data centers becoming an important driver, especially in the United States, where it accounts for 50% of demand growth over the next decade. Electric vehicles, we have mentioned those in China. Not only cars, but increasingly trucks are pushing up electricity demand in China, together with the needs for electricity in advanced manufacturing, clean tech manufacturing. And in the Middle East, together with cooling, big demand growth coming from desalination. So big growth in all scenarios, and also, of course, clearly in the access scenario, but even more in a scenario that is compatible with reaching net zero by 2050. Very clearly, the way we will supply this electricity demand will shape the future of the outlook in the next 10 years, and this is actually what we are seeing. We are seeing that all low emission technologies are growing. They are growing strongly, led by solar PV, for a combination of reasons. Clearly, the cost competitiveness, the continued policy support in many countries, and an important point is that 80% of the demand growth is actually happening in countries where the solar resources are excellent. This is in sharp contradiction with what we were seeing in the past years, where the electricity demand growth was not necessarily in areas where solar resources were as good. Wind is also growing, hydro is also growing, bioenergy and geothermal is also growing, and nuclear, as Dr. Birol mentioned in his introductory remark, is actually seeing a strong comeback. Generation by 2035 is around a third higher, interest in over 40 countries, and we are with 70 gigawatts under construction at a peak over what we have seen of activity over the past 30 years. Natural gas is also growing in the United States, in the Middle East, but also moving towards the Asian market, and Tim will come to this in a minute. Coal, we are actually expecting a peak within 2030, the reason being strong competition coming from the renewables on one hand and cheaper natural gas on the other. So we are going to witness this increasing importance of electricity in our economies. At the same time, the power systems are changing. They're becoming more variable, so there is an increasing needs for flexibility. At the same time, we are actually witnessing a very strong increase in cyber attacks, a tripling over the past 4 years, and an increasing impact of extreme weather events that have actually impacted over 200 million families over the past year. So the power sector needs to adapt, and needs to adapt to another thing, which is the increasing peak demand. We have mentioned cooling, but there are other reasons why peak demand is increasing very strongly. And to give you a sense of how much peak demand is increasing, over the next 10 years, peak demand will increase more than what the increase in dispatchable capacity was over the past 10 years. What does this mean? It means that we will be seeing increasing dispatchable capacity across all the range of technologies to 2035 to meet this increase in peak demand, to ensure security of supplies. But there is a very clear new star here on the block. Among the largest growth that we are seeing is battery storage, increasing by nearly a factor 10, and clearly becoming an essential component of reliable and secure electricity systems in the future. And now to Tim.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Laura. I'm going to pick up the story and looking at the coverage this morning of the new World Energy Outlook. There's a lot of interest in the oil demand outlook, and in particular the difference between that trajectory in the current policy scenario, which sees oil demand increasing all the way through to mid-century, reaching 113 million barrels a day. And that, as the executive director mentioned, the flattening that we have in the stated policy scenario around the end of this decade. So we thought we'd dive in and investigate what are the differences between those two scenarios. As you can see on the screen, as of today, the world consumes around 100 million barrels a day of oil. And there are some sectors that see growth in all of our scenarios. That's led by industry, particularly the use of oil products as petrochemical feedstocks. That's an area which sees growth also in the net zero scenario. But there's aviation, there's shipping. There are also some sectors that see declines in both scenarios. And one of them is the use of oil for power, particularly in the Middle East, where it's been swapping out in favor of natural gas and renewables, but also the use of oil for heating, where it's losing out to electricity and again to natural gas. But it's all about what happens in that road transport sector. As was mentioned, it's almost half of global oil demand. And that's where we see the big difference, because whereas in the current policy scenario, we don't see overall much change over the next 10 years. As you can see in the stated policy scenario, that's the sector where declining consumption brings us down to, in 2035, to around the levels that we saw last year. And most of that difference is to do with what happens to EVs. Now, in some countries, there's no debate, and China is one of them. We're already seeing new car sales in China, 50% are electric. That goes up over the next 10 years to more than 90% in all our scenarios. And it's not just about cars, it's buses, it's scooters, but increasingly also freight transport as well. And in the CPS, they're followed by Europe, where there are those strong policy support for electrification. But in the CPS, elsewhere, there's not that same dynamism, so we don't see the real pickup in electric mobility. And that's the big differentiating factor then with the stated policy scenario, where we see much more dynamism also in other parts of the world, particularly in emerging and developing economies. So this is a story about policies, but it's also about costs, a story about recharging infrastructure, but also in the end, consumer preferences. Now, there are other factors in play. Fuel efficiency policies play a role. The way that we collect and recycle plastics plays a role. But the big reason why we have that difference between those two oil demand trajectories that I talked about is because of EVs. Wanted to say a few words also on the outlook for gas, and highlighting that topic that was picked up by the executive director, that wave of LNG. Now, we've been highlighting in the World Energy Outlook already for a number of years that we expect to see a lot of new LNG coming to market. But that wave of LNG over the last 12 months has got considerably bigger. 2025 has been a really remarkable year for approvals of new LNG export facilities. So this year we've seen almost 100 billion cubic meters worth of new export projects approved. That's only just short of the all-time record we saw in 2019. And just to give you a sense of how big 100 BCM is, that's all of the LNG that's imported by Japan, and Japan's the second largest global importer. And so over the next few years, the US is now set to extend its lead as the world's largest LNG exporter. And it is quite a remarkable picture, given that with the exception of a very small project in Alaska, the US only started to export LNG at all less than 10 years ago. So if we stack up all of those existing and new projects from the US, but also Qatar, from Canada, from elsewhere, we have that 300 billion cubic meters worth of new capacity coming on the market. And then the question goes, so where does that go? What does it mean for prices? There is significant downward pressure on prices in our scenarios. Welcome news, of course, for importing countries. And to a degree, that's picked up by some of the big established importers in the European Union, in China, in Japan. But the biggest growth is elsewhere, where those lower prices help to bring gas into markets like India, where imports double to 2030, and Southeast Asia, where they triple. That is not enough to absorb all of the new LNG that's coming to market in the stated policy scenario. So a question that arises then is, how does that market clear? One way, and that's what happens in the CPS, is that there's a slower pace of transitions in the EU and in China, and that LNG is needed to fill the gap. Another option is that the gas displaces more coal. There's really ample potential for more coal to gas switching. But there's also a word of warning there, because the sorts of prices that you would need in order to make that switch an economic proposition are also very, very difficult for LNG exporters to match. And a market where you have LNG prices falling to $5 per MBTU, that doesn't feel like a healthy, balanced market. You would expect to see a price correction coming after that. Another big topic for our outlook this year is critical minerals, where the key risk is high levels of market concentration, and especially for refining and processing. And what you're looking at on the screen is the share of the top refining country for a range of energy-related strategic minerals. The ones you're looking at the moment are mainly the battery metals, but also copper, which is absolutely at the heart of a more electrified system, as well as rare earths, which have very much been in the news in recent months. And the interesting finding here is that since 2020, the degree of concentration has actually increased for all of these critical minerals. And we get a similar picture of high concentration if we expand our horizons to strategic minerals that are not just vital for energy technologies, but also play a crucial role in other sectors, such as for AI chips and data centers. And that remains the case if we look at minerals that are useful for some energy technologies, for gas turbines or in the nuclear industry, but also very important in sectors like defense and aerospace. And overall, for 19 out of the 20 strategic minerals that you're looking at on the screen, a single country is responsible for the largest share. That's China, with an average 70% market share. And as has been said, when you have that degree of reliance on a small number of suppliers or a single supplier, that does increase vulnerability to shocks and disruptions. That's one of the key lessons of energy history across a range of fuels and technologies. And as of today, more than half of those minerals are subject to some form of export control. Now, governments are waking up to the implications of this, and we track all of the policies and the financing instruments that are out there, and there's been a real surge in awareness and action by governments to try and introduce more resilience and diversity to these value chains. That is starting to bear fruit, but one of our messages, when we look at all of the projects that are approved and that we think are going to come into operation before 2035, that there's still work to do. So on the mining side, we do see some reduction in concentration, but likewise on the refining side. But I think it's clear from our analysis that there's a lot of work to be done. And our conviction is that market forces alone are not going to deliver that resilience and that diversity that we need. There is a need for coordinated, determined policy action to enhance preparedness against potential disruptions, but also to build up new partnerships and projects that diversify supply chains more quickly. And this will continue to be a very important focus for the International Energy Agency. Now, to round us off, I'm going to pass it back to Laura.
Thank you, Tim. So, another commonality of both of our scenarios in STEPS and CPS is actually that what we find is by 2030, we will still have hundreds of millions of people that lack both access to electricity and clean cooking. In particular, our recent tracking shows that electricity access stalled completed progress as of 2020, and clean cooking access, especially sub-Saharan Africa, has not improved dramatically over the past couple of years. So last year, Dr. Birol hosted a summit on clean cooking in Africa, and there was a very clear request from countries to understand and learn from the Global South where success has happened, how can that be reproduced. And this is the frame of this access scenario. We have looked at all countries that have successfully resolved both clean cooking and electricity, and have tried to map these success stories towards countries that still need to accelerate progress. And what we find, replicating best history of success in the past, is that we could achieve by 2035 full access to electricity and full access to clean cooking by 2040. What you clearly see is that this would require a step change in both cases, in particular for sub-Saharan African countries, where we would need to see a significant acceleration both for clean cooking and for electricity. And what we find is that the solutions are known and they are viable. For clean cooking, we find that LPG could provide most of the new connections to clean cooking facilities alongside natural gas in cities, bioenergy, biomethane, and electricity in more rural areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. On the electricity access side, we do see that grids and mini-grid would provide most of the new access solutions, grids that are increasingly fueled by solar, hydro, natural gas, and of course, off-grids, mostly solar solutions. Another implication of the scenarios is obviously what's happening to CO2 emissions and therefore climate change. And what we're seeing here is that for CPS, CO2 emissions would basically stabilize around today's level through 2050. Steps would imply a peak and a gentle decline to 2050, and of course, by design, the net zero scenario would see emissions getting to zero in 2050. What are the implications of these CO2 trajectories to temperature? CPS, as Dr. Birol mentioned at the beginning, would imply a steady increase of temperature to today's warmest year, 2025 at 1.4 degrees, through to around 3 degrees in 2100, steps to around 2.5 degrees, and NZD for the first time bridging 1.5 actually along all other scenarios already in 2030 and staying above this level for a few decades. These temperature findings very clearly show that there is a need to increase resilience across the energy sector. Again, another reminder back to energy security threats. And with this, I pass the floor to Dr. Birol, or to General.
May I say something else?
Sure, yeah.
Just to finish. Thank you very much, first of all, Laura, Tim. Dear colleagues, before we finish our briefing, I want to underline two final issues here, and both my colleagues have mentioned. But the first one is, these are scenarios, these are not forecasts. So this is, I think, it is sometimes deliberately, sometimes by mistake, there is a bit confusion there. We make scenarios, different outcomes for the governments, industry, all stakeholders to look into and make their policies, their choices. This is number one. Number two, for us, transparency is extremely important. You will see all these scenarios and all of the assumptions on the prices, on the investments, on the projects, data, all the data and our assumptions will be, and the policies we assume will be in our website. I think it is, they are going to website today or tomorrow, yes, today. So there's a full transparency from our side, and we hope that there's a full transparency for everybody. And with this, I turn to you. Just also one good news is that I just understood that more than 60,000 people are watching this webinar. This, I guess, another record. It is as much as a derby match, I would say, here. So thank you very much for your attention, for your interest, for our World Energy Outlook. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Birol, and yes, clearly a lot of interest in the report and in the presentation, a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you, Laura and Tim. So we now have time to take some questions from journalists on the presentation and obviously the findings of the report overall. So we now invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom, if you haven't done so already, and please mention your media outlet along with your question. We're just going to take a break for just a few minutes to give you a chance to send your questions, and we'll be right back. Thanks. Hello everyone, welcome back. So thank you very much to the journalists for the questions. We have quite a lot to get through, especially I think several questions on the scenarios, notably the new scenario or the new old scenario, the current policy scenario. So we'll maybe go through as many of those as we can, and they cover different angles. So we'll go through those, and Dr. Birol, Lara and Tim can address them. So firstly, from Ron Busso of Reuters, he asks, he says, thank you for the report and presentation. Is the CPS, the current policy scenario, a response to political pressure from the Trump administration? And then he has a question directly to Dr. Birol. As a preeminent energy expert and economist, do you believe that the CPS, the current policy scenario, is a likely scenario? Then from Nicholas Kermeyer of Euractiv, he asks about the CPS as well. He says CPS is so narrow that it forecasts no growth in the EV share outside of Europe and China. Do you think that this is a serious analysis, a serious possibility, producing a surge in oil demand? And he also asked whether the IEA has been under pressure from governments to reintroduce the CPS. And also questions about, from Tim McDonald of Semaphore, about how different governments influence the findings on net zero, the net zero scenario. And then a final question from Lucy Pedrola of RSE Data News, distinguishing between the scenarios. What's the difference between the current policy scenario and the stated policy scenario? Could you be more specific on the differences? Which policies are included in STEPS and not in CPS? I think on that particular question, I think that we have a good commentary on our website that Lara and Tim wrote. We published just a few days ago, which kind of explains the different scenarios and the assumptions. And there is also a good amount of explanation in the report itself. But obviously, if anyone has anything to add on that, I think Lucy Pedrola would be grateful. But Dr. Birol, perhaps, there's a few different questions there. The CPS, why did it come back?
So I may start a bit, and then maybe my colleagues, Lara Koz and Tim Good, can elaborate. So, dear colleagues, I tried to mention at the beginning, there are growing uncertainties today in the world. From economic side, from energy side, from political side, and the views of governments around the future of energy choices are differing from each other widely. So in order to address these uncertainties, we have increased the number of scenarios, increasing the number of uncertainties, and increasing number of scenarios as a response to that. Of course, we are getting suggestions, critics, and pushes from everywhere, not only from one government, from many governments, stakeholders, every day, on a daily basis, in fact. And we try to provide a framework looking at these concerns, thoughts, preoccupations, so that it can be discussed on the basis of numbers, on the basis of data. And if we follow this pathway, these are the consequences we show to them. Whether or not I personally attach any probability to any of the scenarios, I wouldn't say so. Some stakeholders, some governments, some energy industry, or the civil society or academia may attach different probability to different scenarios. It is up to them. But as IEA, our job is put the data on the table, the pathways, and at the same time, if you follow this pathway, what are the consequences for the affordability, energy security, for emissions, for access, competitiveness, all of them. It is up to governments, up to stakeholders to choose whatever the path they would like to follow. But there is enough data and scenarios on the table provided by the IEA, and all in a transparent way. Maybe, Laura, would you like to elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, maybe I would just like to add something about process. To put together the World Energy Outlook takes about a year, and we have all our modeling team that we lead with Tim and others across the agency. So it's a 1 year work that is fully data-driven. So we look at the data, we look at the latest policies, and we do our modeling exercise, and we put forward to all of you the findings of these different scenarios, and very clearly what are the assumptions that lead to different scenarios. There was a reference to influence, and very clearly our process is the following. We put out a draft for review, and this year unprecedented number of reviewers, 175 people reviewed the report, and we had over 3,000 comments. Of course, the responsibility remains solely with the Secretariat, but this is how we put together our analysis.
Tim, you want to add something on this?
Yeah, maybe to pick up a point that was asked about the EV projections also in the CPS. So some starting points for that are, we do have a lot of momentum, particularly in China, where, in our view, around 2/3 of the EVs models on sale are cost competitive on an upfront basis with the conventional alternatives. And that gives everything a great deal of momentum in that market. But elsewhere, you do still need a push. You do still need a push from policy to make those models attractive for consumers. And very importantly, you need a push from policy on the recharging side. Because unless you have that infrastructure in place, you will get some EVs sold, but they are going to be focused on households that are able to charge at home. And so there is that degree of policy contingency that plays out differently across our scenarios. And where we don't see specific evidence of those policies already in place, then in the CPS, it is an uphill struggle for electric mobility to gain the sort of momentum that you would see. Having said that, when we look at the stated policy scenario, you do see a greater uptake of EVs in different markets around the world. And we also benchmarked our outlooks against some of the plans and strategies put in place by the large auto producers. And when we look at the picture in 2035 relative to those plans, you can see that CPS is right around the bottom end of that, and even slightly lower in some cases. But STEPS is more or less in the middle of the ranges that you get when you examine the strategies and production plans of the largest car companies around the world.
Thank you, Tim, Laura, Dr. Birol, for those answers. So we're getting more questions. One from Michele Bertelli from Domani, the Italian newspaper, but I think that's one we've already covered about facing any pressure while drafting the report. I think Laura explained the process quite well there. Also questions on critical minerals. You talk about high levels of market concentration and say that markets won't solve this and policymakers need to intervene. but what does that actually mean? Also, on the age of the age of electricity, you say that that's arrived, but what is the basis for that? What are the implications? And then, one from Tim McDonnell from Semaphore, who I think is writing to us from Belém in Brazil, if I'm correct. Apologies if not. He says at COP30, President Lula of Brazil proposed creating a new roadmap report that would elaborate on what is required to achieve the transition away from fossil fuels goal articulated at COP28 in Dubai. Such a roadmap would closely resemble the net zero scenario in the World Energy Outlook. Have you discussed this proposal with Brazil? And would you like to see closer collaboration between the IEA and the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? So critical minerals, perhaps one for you, Tim?
Yeah, certainly happy to pick that up. And thanks very much for the question. The difficulty that we see there is the fact that when we look at the costs, particularly for some of those refining and processing side, the costs of a new facility in that space are on average 50% higher than the costs faced by the incumbent. So clearly you would need some way of leveling the playing field and allowing some of those new entrants to compete. Now, some of the options that are available to policymakers are to provide a degree of demand certainty for those facilities. So using sort of the levers of public procurement also to make sure that there is a degree of certainty of demand there for someone coming in to the market. A second option could be to use a sort of standards-based approach where if you define certain qualities that the production process for those new entrants or that you're looking for in the market, whether that's related to environmental performance or social performance, you can also then allow responsible producers, both in the mining and the refining side, to differentiate themselves and have a greater degree of market share. You can also look at things like price caps and floors in order to, in a sense, limit the otherwise sort of existential level of market risks that some of these new entrants would face. And we're working with our member countries and others to try and think through some of the policy levers that are being deployed already in some cases, but we could be deployed to get that greater degree of diversity in the value chain.
Thank you, Tim. Age of electricity, Laura, maybe one that you could address.
So thank you, Jethro. So first of all, if you look at past data, it's already very clear that electricity demand is growing at a faster rate than energy demand. It was a ratio 2-to-1 over the past decade. And because of how the economy is changing and relying increasingly to electricity, because of electrification efforts being on transport, being on heating, because of digitalization and the rise of AI, we are actually seeing electricity becoming much more important for our economy. Sometimes we say the electricity accounts for only 20% of final energy uses and therefore is not as critical. Actually, our analysis shows very clearly that in all scenarios, by 2035, sectors accounting for more than half of the global economy will be dependent on electricity. So our global economy will thrive if we are able to provide affordable, reliable sources of electricity. And I close just with this point. Across all of our scenario, the inputs to the electricity sector account for the largest part of growth in energy demand. So it's the electricity sector, and now we are going to be fueling it, that will determine at least 2/3 of energy demand growth over the next decade.
Thank you, Laura. More questions keep coming in. I think we're going to have to stop soon because we've gone over an hour, which is might be a record as well. Dr. Birol's been talking about records. But one question, I'm just going to, add two more questions, both referring to the net zero emissions scenario. So one from Javier Blas from Bloomberg Opinion. He says, I may have missed it, but I don't see in the report the message that no new oil investment is needed. And that message that has been included in different forms and some caveats since 2021 with the when we launched the net zero roadmap. He notes that on page 351, you discuss the need for continued investment in both oil and gas to counteract decline rates. Obviously, that's something we discussed in depth in a report released in September on decline rates from existing oil and gas fields. So Javier, his question is, am I right that you are taking back your previous no new investment needed? And if so, why? And then also a question on the net zero emissions scenario from, and apologies for my pronunciation, Mr. Kjetil Hovland from E24 in Norway. How do you view the challenges of reaching the net zero emissions pathway now compared to a few years ago? So perhaps before we come back to Dr. Birol to conclude and speak a bit about the COP30 question, Tim, you could speak about the no new investment message in Javier's question, and Laura, you could speak more globally about the challenges of reaching a net zero pathway.
Sure, happy to do that. And as we've talked about in the past, in a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, you need to see a very rapid scaling up in all sorts of low emissions technologies and infrastructure, both for electricity and for fuels. And if that proceeds at the rate that we have in that scenario, that has consequences then for the trajectory of oil, gas and coal demand. And they fall in a way that it is possible to meet that demand just with continued investment in existing fields, and that you would not in aggregate need new investment in long lead conventional new fields. That has been the case in previous editions. It is the case also in this edition of the net zero emissions scenario. I will find the page reference and pass it on in case that wasn't the right one.
Thank you, Tim. Maybe Laura on the challenges of reaching a net zero pathway.
Yeah, so we started doing the net zero scenario back 5 years ago upon request of the UK presidency of COP26, and it was a request on understanding what would it mean for the energy sector, translating for the energy sector, what would it mean limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And we have since then done what is called a backcasting exercise to understand what would we need to do to get to net zero by 2050. And I think there are a few elements that have gone quickly in the energy sector, such as renewables. Our latest analysis shows that by 2030 we're actually seeing or going very close to the tripling of renewables by 2030, but at the same time emissions have remained high, and other parts of the energy sector have not moved as quickly. For example, energy efficiency has not improved as fast. Hydrogen projects have not been deployed as fast as we were suggesting 5 years ago. So we have updated fully our net zero scenario, and what I think the key point is really understanding that with what has happened over the past 5 years, with the sectors that have gone in line and what the sectors that have gone more sluggish, it's now if you want to keep limiting temperatures to 1.5, we will still see an overshoot, and we will need an increasing amount of carbon removal from the atmosphere. So some parts of the energy sector going quite strongly, but emissions remaining stubbornly high, requiring removal afterwards.
Thank you, Laura. And Tim McDonald from Semaphore is getting worried that we've skipped his question on COP, but fear not, Tim, we're getting there. We're just trying to squeeze a couple more questions in. But I will now pass to Dr. Birol. Just a reminder that Tim's question about COP was regarding President Lula talking about a new report that would elaborate on a pathway to the transition away from fossil fuels. Have you discussed this proposal with Brazil? And would you like to see closer collaboration between the IEA and UNFCCC? And I guess you were in Belém late last week, so perhaps your thoughts on COP at this point.
Yeah. And this is the last question. I guess we have to go to work as well. So we have many things to do. So first of all, about COP. I wanted to first of all thank President Lula for inviting the IEA to Belém. I was a few days ago in Belém. I discussed with the world leaders many issues and climate change, but also a big chunk of my discussion was also on the, as I told you, Laura, on the clean cooking in Africa. So many of the countries are also worried about this issue. I met IES contribution there. We have not received any suggestion from Brazil or another country for such a project that our colleague Tim has suggested. But with Brazil and IEA work closely together. But the most important one of our close cooperation is that only a few weeks ago, the Brazilian foreign minister and the energy minister in an official letter sending to me saying that Brazil is now ready to be a full member of the International Energy Agency, which is, I think, a good news for the IEA and for the international energy governance. With this, if I can finish by saying that dear colleagues, again, so many thousands of people and so many journalists asking so many questions, how proud I am as the head of this International Energy Agency and as a former worker of the World Energy Outlook that there are many outlooks, projections, scenarios made by different stakeholders in the industry, other international institutions, national institutions about the world, but it is always the World Energy Outlook which determines the international energy agenda every year in November. I am really thankful to my colleagues Lara Cosi, Tim Gould, and the entire World Energy Outlook team that we have once again determined the international energy agenda. Our aim is very simple. We want to put the data, facts on the table. It is up to governments, up to energy industry, up to academia, the civil society, everybody to choose what the pathway they want to follow without forgetting what the consequences of those pathways are. And as usual, we are very open to suggestions, improvement in our work, and everything is in a transparent way at our website as of today. So thank you very much to all of you. But first of all, to my colleagues at the World Energy Outlook team. And tomorrow, we have our oil market report.
Yes, it doesn't stop there. Tomorrow, we have the November oil market report. We're also releasing, as you're talking about Brazil, an energy policy review of Brazil at COP30. So yeah, lots happening. It never really stops. But this press webinar does need to stop now, I think, because my computer's going to run out of battery, and so I won't be able to see any more questions. So thank you all very much. If you do have questions, journalists that didn't get answered, please do reach out to our press office and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Many thanks to Dr. Birol, to Laura, to Tim. Thank you very much to the journalists for the great questions. Thank you to everyone for following this event online, for your interest in our work. As mentioned, the full World Energy Outlook 2025 is freely available on our website, along with all kinds of infographics with the AI GPT agent that I mentioned to help explore the different findings. Unless you're Javier and you read every single page, the GPT agent can help you. But there is just a huge trove of data and analysis in there, so do please take a look. Thank you and goodbye.